All right, gamers, it finally happened. And by finally, I mean like a month later. So unless you've been living under a rock, you know, with Patrick Star at the bottom of the ocean, you probably heard about the Nintendo price hikes. They're like, okay, video games are going to cost more. Now, a lot of people immediately speculated this was going to sort of unlock a new price tier for their competitors. Basically, as soon as one person has the balls to do it, everyone else is going to jump on board. And lo and behold, I have this from IGN and Forbes as of May 1st. So happy May 1st. Microsoft raises the prices of all Xbox Series consoles. Xbox games confirmed to hit $80 this holiday. So not only the games, which was, you know, maybe to be expected, but also the console itself, which is I would say an almost unprecedented move. Usually throughout the lifetime of a console, you have the debut price, then 2 years later, they come out with a revision, you know, work out some kinks, and then they release it for like, you know, $100 cheaper. This has been how it's worked for the past, I would say, almost 20 years. So this is a hard left turn. And here we have from Forbes, this first sentence: Xbox hardware sales continue to decline year over year by significant amounts, but Microsoft is now about to dig until they can find a bottom, it seems. Whew. Scathing criticism from Forbes. The company is raising prices on all Xbox hardware by $80 to $100 worldwide, and will also plan to release $80 games this year. One thing that people always bring up when it comes to video game pricing is that video game pricing has not followed, or it has not properly tracked inflation, which is true. We had $50 games for like 10 years, and then we had $60 games for another 10 years, despite inflation going up astronomically within the past 10 years alone. But something I never hear those people talk about, you know, as if, because I feel like they're almost trying to justify the price to us gamers. They're like, oh, it's not so bad. You guys are complaining. Here's the thing. Gaming is now an incredibly powerful economic force. Over the past 10 years, I think it's surpassed all other forms of entertainment in terms of absolute volume of sales. So, you know, movies are almost a thing of the past. Everyone's a gamer now. So when we talk about inflation, we also have to talk about the incredible increase of volume of sales. And that is why I think that gaming has been somewhat resistant to inflation, is because the economy of scale that we're dealing with is so much larger than it was in the past. Nonetheless, we have to be critical here, and we have to think, what happened before? Can we look at history? Will history repeat itself? Enter the video game crash of 1983. So I don't know if you are familiar with this, but back in 1983, it was a different scene. If you've watched one of the old AVGN videos, you probably know, but there wasn't just like 3 big consoles. Let's take a look, actually. So they had what they call oversaturation of consoles. There wasn't a big 3. It was sort of anyone's game. Look at all this. There's at least 12 competing consoles. So in understanding what happened in the video game crash of 1983, we can look at some of the factors and then think, is that going to happen again? So there was some economic factors leading up to this. There was a recession. There was an oversaturation of consoles. We don't really have that problem. There was also some market apprehension due to pricing. So let's look at some of the pricing of these things. So one of the consoles that came out right before the crash, 1982, here we have the Atari 5200, which debuted for $269. Let's take this into inflation calculator. So $1983 in 2025 would be $863.71. So this is still pricey, even by our standards. Yes, the Switch 2 is still cheaper than this, but you have to understand there are people being priced out by the Switch 2. But keep in mind, when you talk about price increases, we've just seen that Xbox is going to be more expensive, period, the console itself, in addition to all the games. So in addition to the base price of the console, how many games are you buying per year, and how far is your money getting you? So let's look at another factor of the 1983 video game recession, which I think is very interesting. Competition from home computers. So right around this time, home computing was becoming sort of commercially available and successful. Prior to that, you know, computers were the size of a room and they were just at MIT or whatever. But around this time, people could buy computers. They started to become useful objects. Now, at the current era we live in, I would argue that the PC, the home computing unit, is much more useful than consoles. So what I'm going to argue is that you can be somewhat resistant to the video game forces that are happening right now. You know, Microsoft raising the prices of all games, and Xboxes, you know, Nintendo doing their pricing shenanigans. You can be resistant to this and nice and insulated in the PC ecosystem. Now, up until this point, it has always been challenging to argue, because PC gaming has always been more expensive. It's the truth. It is somewhat difficult to put together a PC that's going to meet the same price points and the same performance points as, you know, the best consoles on the market today. However, we've got the signals now. Microsoft has raised their prices. When's Sony gonna follow? How expensive is the PlayStation going to be? So in response to these price hikes, I think that consumers are going to have to look at the PC gaming ecosystem. So welcome to Steam. I don't know what to tell you if you're not aware of Steam. This is a PC gaming platform, you know, one of several. There's GOG. I guess I could mention Epic Games. And essentially, they've done nothing, and they're going to come out on top. Their gaming strategy was to do nothing and win, because let's just go through the top games here. You're going to see some very affordably priced games, you know, not just indie titles, but basically everything on the platform will go on sale very routinely. You know, here we got Baldur's Gate 3 at a very appropriate $59.99. I think that's a fair price for an enormous game like that. We have to talk about the elephant in the room here. Let's say you buy a PC, maybe it's a little more expensive still than a console, and you have no games, but then you spend $60 on a VPN subscription for a year. Suddenly, whoa, you have all of the games. Whoa, that's kind of, I'm not saying you would do that. Of course you would pay for those delicious, tasty indie games to support the indie game developers. But you know, for AAA, I don't know, somehow it's on your hard drive. I don't know how that happened. Of course, you would never do that because you're a morally upstanding citizen who always pays for games. But, you know, some people would do that. I don't know who they are. So I have to ask, what more is it going to take? How far can you push consumers until they look for alternatives? In the video game crash of 1983, video game revenue peaked at around 3.2 billion in 1983, then fell to 100 million by 1985, a drop of almost 97%. Now, I don't think there's any chance that we're going to see numbers like that ever again. That would be shocking. I don't even know what kind of factors could lead to a crash of that size. But do I think that some people are going to be priced out? I do think some people are going to be priced out. And I encourage them to look at alternate solutions, because I think gaming should be an accessible hobby for everyone. And it's kind of bumming me out that it's trending the opposite direction. So I want consumers to be educated, to think about the history of gaming. And, you know, you don't have to let Microsoft and Nintendo bully you. And eventually Sony. Let's be real. If two of the big three have done something, the third is to follow soon. Anyway, I'm the Doom Prophet. If you want to get your video gaming news from a guy that looks like this, subscribe. I encourage you to be informed and to inform everyone you know. If you're getting priced out of gaming, or if you know someone who's getting priced out of gaming, just make sure they know their options. Make sure they know. You know, you don't have to have a Switch 2. All right. Peace out, YouTube.